have John Green here, and let's give him a big round of applause.
Could you hear me? Anyway, I seem to have a role here yeah, this is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. One of the greatest finds that the Sasquatch investigation has ever achieved. Where we'd be without him.
See if I can get away with doing this so I can get over to the screen and point things out and kind of step back so others over here can see a little bit of what's up here. Well, this is really a delight. I mean, these gatherings are always very gratifying for me and always very stimulating. I try to prepare a little something different each time, incorporate new things that are happening and that are coming to the fore. But this is an exceptionally gratifying occasion. As you'll see, I wouldn't be up here were it not for John. I'm quite confident of that. So there was a little confusion on the title of my presentation. I don't think John has been that elusive or difficult to track, but so it's on the track of the Sasquatch with John Green. Now, when I was a youngster and I first saw John Green's
like him.
book, I was struck by how similar he looked to this actor that some of you may recognize, because I was a great fan of science fiction. And the day the Earth stood still, it even makes my goosebumps on my arms when I think about it. But this is Michael Ranney, and you can see there's a striking resemblance. He's a bit, about 10 years John's senior, I think. And so meeting John for the first time, I was struck by the resemblance. In fact, I had to wonder. Now the secret origins of Sasquatch are revealed. Klaatu, Barada, Nikto. I was quite impressed. There's quite a literature on the interpretation of that phrase, and even some philosophers and linguists have speculated as to what it might mean. I think I know what it meant. So now we know. All right. So John was really a larger-than-life figure. So here you can see this dapper young Bigfoot investigator, and then there's me. This was, believe it or not, 15 years ago. Here at this setting was my first public presentation on the subject. And it was quite a colorful event, because as some of you may know, I was discussing an analysis of the Redwoods video, or as more popularly referred to, the Playmate video. Because the co-host of the guest host of the production company that was producing the documentary that happened to get this footage was a former Playmate of the Year. But here I had the privilege of rubbing shoulders with some obviously very prestigious individuals in this field. It was interesting because arriving here in Harrison, there was a little confusion as to my accommodations, and so I was there at the front desk, and there was no room in the inn. So rather than send me out to the stables, John overheard and very hospitably stepped forward and invited me to come home And so I was just tickled beyond description, and not only to spend the time with John Green, but John Bindernagel was also his house guest. And so that was my first introduction. As we sat there and compared notes, you know, I had recollections of ordering my copy of On the Track of the Sasquatch after I had been introduced to it by my school librarian. This is back in about 5th or 6th grade. And as we talked about it, he said, well, where did you go to school? He apparently thought it was a little unusual that a grade school librarian would have a copy of this on hand. And I said, well, it was in Spokane, Washington, Indian Trail Elementary. And he said, do you remember the librarian's name? I said, well, no, I was kind of back there. And he said, was it Mary Vesiker? And it just clicked, and it turns out that was his niece. And he immediately picks up the phone and dials a number and says, Mary, you'll never guess who's sitting across the So it was really quite uncanny, small world. So as has been alluded, John really has introduced a generation to this subject by bringing it to the fore and going to extraordinary lengths to try to elicit scientific interest in this subject. Now, in preparing for this, it was fun to go back and rehearse some of the history. And you'll have to correct me, John, if I get anything wrong here, but it was about 1954 that you bought the advance, right, for the paper. And as a result, then, of, as was mentioned earlier, the Sasquatch days, some of these stories began to come to the fore. And of course, John had heard stories of Sasquatch, about the hairy Indians that lived out in the wilderness. But as the stories took on a different flavor, different texture, that of a giant ape living in the wilderness, a different sort of profile or interpretation. And I shouldn't say really different, but just a slightly varied spin. You know, it doesn't surprise me at all that there are different perceptions of a single phenomenon in talking, and we see that here amongst the Bigfoot community. I mean, there's some rather hotly contested and rather heated discussions about the actual nature of Sasquatch, its position, either as a near human or a near ape entity. But the Ruby Creek incident was one of the first times that John was able to talk to these individuals and to gain some really hard, no-nonsense evidence as to the existence, in this case, in the form of trace evidence, as outlined here in the footprint found at Ruby Creek. It was some time then before other tracks came to his attention. So several years passed, and then the word of the discovery of footprints at Bluff Creek made the press. Now, and here's the classic picture, and I have Tom to thank. He gave me a very nice copy, original print from this news photo of Jerry Crew. Now, what's interesting on the other photograph is Bob Titmus holding that same cast, and you can see, obviously, it's been cleaned up a little bit. Not the way that Bob, unfortunately, sometimes did clean up the cast, but I mean, as far as the dirt, you can see around the toes. So the detail that's obscured here by this still very fresh track pulled out of the ground has been cleaned off, and you can see the toe detail with much greater clarity. There you can see it close up a bit. And it defines those, the details of the toe stems, the slight indication of the split ball in this larger individual that's expressed in a much more dramatic way in the 15-inch individual, the slightly smaller individual that's sometimes also seen in the area. What I have always been impressed with too is the other examples. You know, sometimes we get a stereotypical image based on one particular newsprint that's repeatedly published over and over and over again. But I was always impressed by this one. This appeared when the Humboldt Times sent a reporter up to the scene. And they also printed a photograph of the footprint in the ground, and then the resulting cast. And then the details a little bit a little bit lacking here because this is taken from a newsprint. But the variation in the toe position between these, which are obviously the same individual, but the variation in the toe position display the differential pressure at the foot, or at the heel, excuse me. And this little detail here, this is evidently, and as confirmed by the photograph of the footprint in the ground itself, is a stick that the foot stepped on. Now, if this was a static carved wooden plank of Wallace vintage, it would have teetered on that high point unless it pushed it all the way down into the ground below the surface of the contact of the print. It didn't, though. The print accommodated it, obviously, and this is protruding up into the air above that contact surface quite some distance, suggesting that a soft, pliable sole of a Atlantic grade 8 had conformed to that obstruction and simply accommodated in its step, and may even have resulted in, have caused the toes to be somewhat more splayed. You can't step on something like that without some consequence. Then, a few years later, that same individual, and in fact that individual, that what we refer to as the 16 or 17 inch, and the lengths, you can see there's some variation in print referring to that individual. And it's not surprising because our footprints don't always measure exactly the same length. The prints are a dynamic signature of the step, not an exact replica of the foot itself. And so depending on the depth, depending on the dynamics of the step, they can vary in length just a little bit. But this individual, presumably the big alpha male of this region, his footprints were showing up repeatedly, and they showed up again in hind palm. And so here John is examining a cast which he has in his collection. So here's a photograph I took on one of my visits to John's place. This is back on his deck. And you can see it compared, and it compares remarkably closely to the original Jerry Crew footprint. And there were multiple tracks and photographs taken at that site. And these are great because they show a lot of good variation in toe position, a lot of detailed anatomy. I mean, those are clearly good functional toes that articulate well with the foot, that are interacting with the substrate. They're not Easter eggs or rectangles, or as we'll see some of the examples up here. And of course, this picture has been published in John's book, which shows considerable variation in the toe position between these two different right and left feet at a hind palm. And also a series of casts were made, and these were in Bob's collection, Bob Timmis's collection, so I assume he made them. But again, you can see the variation in toe position, the variation in depth of imprint, and degrees of rotation through the midfoot, all testifying of a very animate footprint. One of them, when viewed on site, has a very interesting detail too that caught my attention. After Bob passed, John invited me up and we went through a lot of his material. I had the opportunity to photograph and document all of his cast material before it was transferred down to the Willow Creek Museum. The screen's a little bit rippled here, but right here where the suggestion of that split in the ball is located, there is a very marked angle right here. And that confirms to me that the interpretation of that split as a flexion crease at the joint, and I'll throw this one out, the helical metatarsal phalangeal joint, at the base of the big toe is in fact coincident with that crease, just as the crease across the palm of your hand coincides with the joint at your knuckles, between your metacarpal, or your carpals, metacarpal, excuse me, and proximal phalanges. So again, a very dynamic feature that certainly is not evident at first glance or expressed to any degree in the Crew footprint or some of the other individual hind palm tracks. Now, there was originally reported to be 3 individuals at hind palm, and they were cited as 17 inch, 16 inch, and a 15 inch. I can't find a differentiation between a 16 and a 17 inch in the casts